Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little subscribe button at the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, click that subscribe button. Really does help our channel grow, our audience grow, and I really do appreciate it more than you know. So click that subscribe button. Appreciate your support. Now, here's the video that you came here for. Switch gears, and I want to go ahead and give a little bit of an update on the fascinating situation going on at Texas A&M with their coaching search, right? And it's kind of crazy. Season's not even officially over yet as I'm recording here, but the coaching carousel is starting to wind down. Michigan State has their man in Jonathan Smith. It appears as though the Sam Pittmans and Chip Kellys of the world are going to stay where they are. And so the big question now becomes what is going to happen at Texas A&M. We've talked a lot about this from all different perspectives. We talked about the Lane Kiffins and the Dan Lannings early. More recently, we talked about the Jedd Fisch type candidates at Arizona. And so I bring it up because why I want to talk about it now on the rare Saturday evening taping during games is because we got two very interesting reports coming out of Black Friday into rivalry weekend on the field. And I want to discuss them both now because I think we're going to get an answer on who is Texas A&M's next head coach over the next, certainly you'd think 24 to 48 hours. They obviously want to have somebody in place to meet with the players so guys don't enter the transfer portal. Remember, because Jimbo Fisher was fired, the players can, in fact, enter the transfer portal. But anyway, let's get to the reports. I'm rambling. Here are the two reports. The first one, Billy Lucci, as not only as plugged in, he is the most plugged in Texas A&M insider on the planet, okay? On Black Friday, he made a post on texags.com basically saying that he believed that the three candidates that the school had really zoned in on, Mike Elko, head coach at Duke, we've talked about. Mark Stoops at Kentucky, whose name has come up on a lot of these coaching carousel lists and you know, coaching search hot boards, etc. And Kyle Whittingham, the head coach at Utah. So very interesting report there. And it is worth noting that report was then corroborated on Saturday morning, College Game Day. Pete Thamel said essentially that he believes Mark Stoops could emerge as the favorite for the Texas A&M job. And then also, I think it was a Brandon Marks, some other insider basically said Mark Stoops could be the favorite. So you have those three with all of a sudden Mark Stoops emerging as the favorite. You also had a separate report, Bruce Feldman on Big Noon Kickoff, saying that if Ryan Day were to lose to Michigan as the Ohio State head coach for the third straight year, he could be feeling the heat and he could be a candidate at Texas A&M. So let's quickly break both of these reports down because they are fascinating, and I want to go ahead and dive in. Let's start with the Friday report because let me tell you this. When I heard this report, my first inclination, Kyle Whittingham is the most interesting name on this list. I cannot imagine Texas A&M would hire Mark Stoops. Well, I bring it up because after years of hearing Mark Stoops' name and all these coaching carousel rumors, we heard him at LSU a few years ago, some of the big Midwest jobs, some of the big SEC jobs when they've opened up. This one could be different. Thought there were two interesting reports from guys that I know, friends of mine, both working for Kentucky Sports Radio. The first one from Nick Roush. This was actually posted on Kentucky Sports Radio on Saturday morning. I read this in the car driving home from my Thanksgiving family get-together. Nick wrote on Kentucky Sports Radio, Nick is the best insider on Kentucky football. He said, this is not the first time Mark Stoops' name has been mentioned in coaching searches. What's different about this one is the source of the information. When Florida State and LSU had openings, his side was lobbying for position through back channels via local media. All of the information this time has leaked from Texas A&M, which leads me to believe this isn't just a coach putting his name in the mix to benefit his own bottom line. Matt Jones, also of Kentucky Sports Radio, another guy that I respect immensely in that market, he said, I do think A&M is the kind of job that Mark Stoops would leave for. I also don't think this is a money play, as the money will be virtually the same, but a resources NIL are a lot more. I would be surprised if A&M would decide to make that higher, but I guess we shall see. So, Mark Stoops, is he the favorite? Two super plugged in Kentucky insiders say the answer is at least that he is interested. And it is worth noting, after Mark Stoops and Kentucky beat Louisville in their big rivalry game there on Saturday, Mark Stoops was asked about this, and he didn't really deny the report. This is what he said. He said, come on, you know better than that. This is a big win for our state and our program and our team. You know how good I've been keeping the focus and concentration on this team, and that's all that it is. Let me just say this. That ain't exactly the Dan Lanning, there is 0% chance I'm leaving report. And so I think that's worth discussing, and I think it is worth diving in to Mark Stoops as a legitimate candidate at Texas A&M. When I look at this, a couple things stand out. One, I think you got to look at it from Mark Stoops' side of things. Also have to look at it from Texas A&M side of things. From the Mark Stoops side of things, I actually think this makes a ton of sense, okay? And it's interesting. I was talking to my radio partner, Jason Martin, about this, Fox Sports Radio every Saturday night. And we were talking about this a few weeks ago, but it does feel kind of like Mark Stoops has kind of hit that ceiling at Kentucky. And there's nothing wrong with it. It is the bottom line. It is the truth. It is reality. It's a really hard job. It's a really hard job. Most years, 7-5, maybe 8-4, maybe you catch a break and Tennessee's really down like they have been under a Butch Jones or a Jeremy Pruitt or whoever. You get that 9th win. But that feels like kind of the ceiling at Kentucky. And it feels like at least up until Saturday. And I know things have changed. Kentucky fans, you're always welcome to comment in the YouTube comments if you disagree. But it feels like Kentucky fans are kind of tired of a lot of the Mark Stoops stuff as well. Complaining about NIL, not being ready in big games. I think some of the frustration this year was some of those, games that you traditionally have won, you've now lost twice in a row to South Carolina. Mississippi State you took care of, but they fired their coach a week later, so it's not like it was any great victory. You do have the Louisville win, but you finished what? 2-5, 2-6. I guess it would have been 2-5 down the stretch. It is not great, but I also think from Mark Stoops' perspective, you have to think if you're going to leave Kentucky, now really feels like it has to be the time, right? This is now the time to leave because you're 7-5 again. That is a great, if this was year 3, that'd be a great season, but you've done it a few times now. You haven't really gotten over the hump against elite teams, and things are about to get much tougher for you, right? Because obviously the SEC is expanding next year, Texas, Oklahoma coming to the league. Also think this is worth noting as well. This is really important. Divisional games are now over, as are the traditional cross-division game. So Kentucky has really benefited this, I believe, more than maybe anybody, because every year in the division, we know the SEC East is weaker than the West. Every year they get Vanderbilt. Every year they've gotten South Carolina, as South Carolina has kind of gone through a down spell. And they've gotten Mississippi State as their cross-division game. Well, now you'll still get some of those teams in any given year, but you don't get all 3 every single year. Not to mention most years Missouri isn't a 10-2 type team. This is the best Missouri team they've had since Gary Pinkel left. So the point I'm trying to make, Florida's been a little bit down. That schedule that had 6, 7, baked in wins, if you include 3 out of conference games, all of a sudden that gets much tougher with Texas, Oklahoma, and no divisions. So from Mark Stoops' perspective, I think it makes sense. What's much more interesting, I don't think that Texas A&M fans would be excited at all if Mark Stoops end up being the guy. And I don't want to speak for every Texas A&M fan in the same way that I don't want to speak for every Kentucky fan being frustrated with the situation with Mark Stoops. I don't want to speak for every Texas A&M fan. But my hunch is I don't think Texas A&M fans would be excited at all for Mark Stoops to be the head coach. Listen, I know what I just said. What Mark Stoops has done at Kentucky is incredible. This was the worst program in the SEC when he took over. Remember, James Franklin was at Vanderbilt, and James Franklin had Vanderbilt rolling, okay? Florida was in a better place. Tennessee was not in as good of a place, but they were they were still better than Kentucky. What he did at Kentucky is incredible. But I do think the last year or so, it does feel to me like the rest of it, it went from Stoops is building something to what Stoops has done is incredible to it feels like the rest of the SEC. I think most everybody that's not a Kentucky fan has the same opinion on Kentucky. A great deal of respect for Mark Stoops, a great deal for what he's built, but they kind of know, look, the Florida wins and the South Carolina wins in some years and the Mississippi State wins in some years are great, but we've seen you against Georgia. You're 2-8 against Tennessee. Like I said, the only time that you get Tennessee is when they're really, really down and they end up firing a coach. So not surprisingly, you haven't had success against Alabama. And so it's not that a Kentucky coach is supposed to beat Alabama and supposed to beat Georgia and supposed to go 12-0. But most of those games, they're not even close. They're not even competitive. And I think that's where a lot of the frustration from Texas A&M fans would come in. Beyond that, I also think the way Mark Stoops coaches would not be all that appealing. Remember, Texas A&M is coming off the Jimbo Fisher era, where they were promised great, explosive, high-scoring offenses, and at least the last couple of years did not get that. Well, Kentucky, we know how they've been under Mark Stoops. Now, I think Mark Stoops will probably argue, if he gets this job, he will probably argue that, ultimately, we're going to open things up and it's going to be different. But he is who he is. He's an older guy. He's a defensive-minded coach. This is never going to be a guy that throws the ball 35, 40 times a game. This is never going to be a guy that has an offense that routinely puts up 35, 38, 40 points a game, okay? And so I think that's where the Texas A&M frustration would be. 7-5 season this year. All of that, whatever. You kind of get the point. It'll be interesting to see if he's really a legitimate candidate. Do want to switch gears and talk about some of those other candidates and the other reports. First of all, let me say this. If Texas A&M has a legitimate shot at Kyle Whittingham, maybe I'm crazy. And maybe everybody will disagree. I think you have to crawl over glass to get Kyle Whittingham. The only real knock on Kyle Whittingham is that he's 64 years old. He ain't a spring chicken anymore, okay? But what he has done at Utah was in what? The WAC, the Mountain West, whatever it was when he took over. I guess it was the Mountain West. I get it. He took over for Urban Meyer, whatever. It's not that he took over bottom of the barrel. But he has now built it into one of the most consistently excellent programs in all of college football. You could say, whatever. I mean, he's won back-to-back Pac-12 championships prior to this year. He's obviously not going to win it this year. He also lost his starting quarterback and never had him all year long and still had a great deal of success. He's a program builder. He's, I don't know. If you can get Kyle Whittingham, I think you would be out of your mind not to take advantage of him. Now, the question becomes with Kyle Whittingham, is this a guy that would actually be interested in the Texas A&M head coaching job? And it's interesting because I was thinking about this. Like, I think on the one hand, as I said, Kyle Whittingham is 64 years old as of this week. Happy birthday, Kyle Whittingham, November 21st. How about that? So I think if you're Kyle Whittingham, I think the question just becomes a couple things. One, do you just want to leave Utah? I mean, you're 64 years old, final few years. I do think it's worth noting, as I said, Cam Rising, your star quarterback, is coming back for another year. He had to redshirt this year because of an injury. So you're going to have an established quarterback. And I think it's also worth noting from the Kyle Whittingham perspective, you're weirdly going to a more winnable conference than you're in right now, right? You think about all these, these expansion and conference realignment stories. Oklahoma's going to a tougher league. Texas is going to a tougher league. Who else? Whatever. Oregon's going to a tougher league. Washington's going to a tougher league. I think Utah is going to an easier league. And I think Utah will be in position in year one to win the Big 12. And remember, next year in a 12-team playoff, the Big 12 is going to get an automatic bid. Not only are you going to get an automatic bid, the top 4 seeds that get first-round buys are all conference champions. So you could potentially be looking at a bye into the final 8 of the college football playoff, hosting a first-round game. And in most years, you're going to be in position to compete for that conference championship because you look at the Big 12 going into next year. Kansas State's interesting. Kansas is interesting. Arizona, who's joining you from the Pac-12. But there's nobody in that league that makes you feel like I can't win this league if Kyle Whittingham is my head coach. So I think from the Texas A&M perspective, if I was them, I'd go all in. I'd tell them, hey, you're 64 years old. You got one last shot at the big time here. Come here. This is an NIL collective world. We can fight it. We can pretend. But everybody knows if you don't have that NIL money, you cannot compete. And so if you're Kyle Whittingham, one last shot at the big time to prove to everybody that you can compete at the highest of levels when you have access to everything that everybody else has. I would be fascinated to see if that happened. Really quickly, Mike Elco, I don't think there's anything new to add there. I still like the hire if it were to happen. Guy with deep Texas A&M ties, recruited a lot of the players on the roster. He was at Texas A&M before they obviously hired or before he went to Duke. He was the defensive coordinator, worked under Jimbo Fisher, knows a lot of the players. I think he would keep the best parts of that staff together, knows what it takes to win there. Finally, let me briefly talk a little bit about Ryan Day. I don't want to spend a ton of time on Ryan Day, but why I bring it up, there are multiple reports over the last couple days that at least kind of insinuate that Ryan Day could potentially be interested in this job, and specifically interested in this job if things go sideways at Ohio State and if they were to lose on Saturday to Michigan. Well, as I record here, they did lose to Michigan. It's their third straight loss to Michigan. And look, Ryan Day's not going to get fired at Ohio State, but his quality of life is not going to be great over the next 365 days a year, because you're not going to the Big Ten championship this year. You're not going to the college football playoff this year. And so you're going to a bowl game that's not the playoff. And it's another 365 days a year that you have to wear that scarlet letter, no pun intended, of not being able to beat Michigan. And so I thought it was interesting. Earlier this week, I mentioned that Billy Lucci is, in my opinion, the most plugged-in Texas A&M insider in that market, okay? Well, he was asked on radio, TexAgs Radio. I go on every week with David Nuno. David had Billy on the show, and they went through all the candidates. And Billy said, I told you Dan Lanning wasn't interested. I told you Dan Campbell wasn't interested. And then David asked about Ryan Day. And Billy hesitated and said, probably not. But if he loses to Michigan, keep an eye out on that. Well, the losses happen. And I don't know what to say. I mean, if you're Texas A&M, you got to do it, right? I mean, if he wants to leave because he knows his quality of life is going to stink, then you have to take advantage of this moment in time and go and get him. I believe the buyout's insane, but if you're Texas A&M, you already spent $75 million on Jimbo. Who cares? Go get Ryan Day, see what happens. I think the counter to Ryan Day, doesn't win the big ones, hasn't beaten Michigan. I don't want to say it because I don't know that I really believe it. But what was Jimbo Fisher before he got to Texas A&M? Offensive genius in a league where he had significantly more talent than everybody else. What is Ryan Day? Offensive genius in a league that he has significantly more talent than everybody else. And the one time a year he plays teams with equal talent in Michigan, he's lost 3 years in a row. So obviously, if the Ryan Day stuff progresses, we'll talk about it and we'll get there. But as of right now, I just can't see myself truly believing that Ryan Day would be the next head coach. But again, he has lost to Michigan for a third straight time, and maybe things will be different this time around. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to the Aaron Torres Pod YouTube channel. New episodes, new videos dropping all the time here. New episodes of the Aaron Torres Pod dropping every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And this Monday's episode will be a doozy. Lock in, subscribe, Apple, Spotify, etc. Also, by the way, check out the Aaron Torres Pod merchandise shop, AaronTorresOnline.com/merchandise for all your merch needs.